You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 7th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Since the day that I announced my candidacy, I set out to find a partner who can help build this brighter future. I found such a leader.
Well, she left it to the last minute, but the results of the Veep stakes are now clear, and we know who Kamala Harris has chosen as her running mate. We'll find out more about Tim Walz. We'll examine the societal impact of Venezuela's disputed election, and we'll check in with our Asia editor to discuss the banning of the Move Forward party in Bangkok. As a slew of negative stories about tech companies and social media giants hits the headlines, we'll ask if Silicon Valley is changing political allegiance and what that might mean for democracy. We'll have a flick through the front pages and a hit of urbanism news from Singapore. And finally...
So how do you organise the Olympics? I'm Emma Nelson in Paris, and a little later I'll share details of one of today's guests who knows a thing or two about running the games. Plus there's fashion and furniture too.
That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The leader of Hezbollah has pledged a strong and effective response to the killing of its military commander by Israel last week, no matter the consequences, and said Hezbollah would act either alone or with its regional allies. Kyiv kept up air attacks on Russia's Kursk border region today, with defence systems destroying at least 5 drones overnight, its acting governor said, after Moscow accused Ukraine of targeting the area with an armoured assault. And the Philippines, Canada, the United States and Australia kicked off their first joint military exercise today in the South China Sea to enhance interoperability among their forces. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Kamala Harris has selected Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate in the presidential race. We'll hear first of all from Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord.
Tim Walz will unleash hell on earth. That was the reliably measured appraisal from the Trump campaign upon learning that Democratic nominee Vice President Kamala Harris has chosen Governor Walz of Minnesota to be her running mate in November's election. In some ways, Walz is not a surprising choice. The Harris campaign wants to appeal to voters in rural parts of the US, and the folksy figure of Tim Walz, who one colleague described as looking like he had just come down from a deer stand, fits the bill. He also has the liberal credentials on reproductive health rights, gun control, and expanding the social safety net to keep the progressive wing of the party on side. His off-the-cuff soundbite in an interview referring to Donald Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance as simply just weird may have been what swung it. But only a few days ago, it had seemed that things might go in favour of Pennsylvania's governor, Josh Shapiro. After all, he sits in perhaps the swingiest of the swing states, and is well liked there amongst the unions. When he cancelled a string of fundraisers in Long Island that were due to happen over the weekend, it seemed to suggest that a decision was made. Politico reports that the VP job interview simply didn't go so well for Shapiro, that Harris and Walz just clicked better, even if they hadn't known each other that much before. But there is no denying that the extensive social media furore about Josh Shapiro's stance on Israel, not least the resurfaced articles he wrote some 20 years ago, and his recent criticisms of pro-Palestinian protesters who set up camp on universities around America, will have played a part in the ultimate decision. Walz and Shapiro are not so far apart from one another on Israel. Both have been critical of the Israeli government's campaign in Gaza, but have maintained the country's right to defend itself. Voters, however, will be less even-handed, especially in the Midwest cities with large Arab American populations. Walz's constituents came out in force to reject Joe Biden during the primaries, marking uncommitted on their ballots in protest of the president's stance on the conflict. With only a few weeks to go to the Democratic National Convention, the question of Israel's campaign in Gaza will loom large. The party is braced for protests, of the kind not seen since 1968 and the darkest days of the Vietnam War.
That's Chris Lord there. Well, I'm joined by Sarah Churchwell, who's Professor of American Literature at London's School of Advanced Study and also an author, a fantastic author. We'll talk more about her books, I hope, another time. Sarah, as Chris said, Governor Walz previously caught the attention by calling Donald Trump weird. That's a great line and it's playing well for Democrats. But he's also been talking a little bit about his background. We know that he used to be a school teacher. And I wonder if you could tell us more about his background before politics.
Absolutely. So first, he was actually a career non-commissioned soldier, and he worked his way up through the ranks. So, he started out as a private, and so we've got a story here that a lot of ordinary Americans are going to relate to. And having worked his way up through the Army, after 20 years, he then paid his way through a lower tier university because that was what he could afford. He got his degree, and then, as you say, he became a high school teacher. He taught what we call social studies, which is kind of a mix of geography, history, and civics. And he became a football coach. And he took a team that had it was a winless team, right? They were like 47-0 or something like that. And he turned them into state champions in 3 years, right? It's a story straight out of television. It's a Ted Lasso story. And then his students told him to run for office. So, and then his political career begins. So you can see how that's a story that's going to connect with a great many Americans. I mean, he's literally the guy who teaches, who coaches their kids at football, and they're going to understand who this guy is.
Do tell us about his political career so far.
Yeah. So then, exactly. So then he actually served in Congress for a while, which I think is going to be really important in the ways that the Harris Walz. It's hard. I'm not used to saying that yet. The Harris Walz campaign frames itself as that he doesn't just have experience in local state politics. He also does have experience at the national level. He was in Congress. He worked across political aisle. He actually was a pretty centrist congressperson working with Republicans to pass legislation. But then when he became governor of Minnesota, he shifted to the left with his constituency, which, they're going to try to attack him on. But, my view is that if you're a representative, you should be reflecting the position of your constituency. And he has passed incredibly progressive legislation. And it's really important to note he's done so with a majority of one. He had a tiny majority. And instead of saving his political capital, he went in there to use it and to pass progressive legislation. So he's passed legislation on childcare, on natal care, worker benefits, voting rights, family leave, workers' rights, you name it. He's been passing it. And so we're seeing also that he's an incredibly effective and very, very popular governor. So he has a lot in his arsenal to bring to this campaign.
Now, George Floyd was murdered in his state. How did he react?
Well, he was, again, I think that that was obviously, a very difficult and divisive moment in the state. But I think, he has been staunchly, pro-civil rights in his response to violence against Black people. And he also worked with community groups on the ground. He made sure that he got there into the community and was working with people to try to, heal the wounds and to improve the, systemic racism in the police force that led to that tragedy. So again, I think that although that was, a very difficult moment and not helped by the fact that the president at the time was, of course, Trump, who was doing everything he could to inflame anger and divisiveness. I think you can see that Walz had a very clear track record of trying to, as he always does, I genuinely think, trying to bring people together and find solutions.
Do you think he'll neutralise J.D. Vance's appeal to rural Midwest voters?
Oh, yeah, I think he'll cut right through it. He started that last night. He immediately got right at the idea that J.D. Vance is an ordinary guy by saying just because Walz did grow up in a town of 400 people in the middle of Nebraska. And he said, yeah, just like everybody I know from small town America, J.D. Vance went to Yale, was funded by Silicon Valley billionaires, and then wrote a bestseller trashing the community he comes from. Right. And that is going to cut through with people. I really think it will.
Yeah. How important is his state of Minnesota in the election race?
Well, people have been dismissing it, saying that it's not one of the 7 swing states that will be deciding the election. And that's true, now. But let's remember that in 2016, people didn't really think that Wisconsin was a swing state. They didn't think that Hillary was going to lose Wisconsin and Michigan, which is why she didn't even go there, which is why she lost them, right? And Minnesota has been turning red. Walz is working within a red shifting community, as is true for some of the states that have larger rural areas like Minnesota. And as your reporter said, Biden didn't win the primary in Minnesota. There were voters, even Democrat voters in the primary who were refusing to vote for Biden. So it was, it's not sewn up. And I think that what's important, what Walz brings to the campaign is the ability to make sure that states that might be leaning purple like Minnesota stay blue, and to speak to swing voters in swing states in a way that they will relate to as a person who's like their neighbor, that they can have a conversation with about the things that really matter to them.
Sarah, finally, you're the daughter of a Midwestern dad. do you recognize Walz? Will he be a good leader?
Oh my God, he is so the dad of everybody that I grew up with. I mean, he just is absolutely the real deal. His decency, I think, comes through, and but he's very genuine, and that's what I mean is that when he's the Harris campaign has been talking about freedom, and they've been framing it as freedom. And last night, Walz came out and said, or as we say at home, mind your own damn business, right? And so she's using the loftier, more abstract rhetoric of freedom, and he's talking the way that Midwesterners talk, which is mind your own damn business. And so, yeah, he is the real deal.
Sarah Churchwell, thank you very much indeed. This is The Globalist. Just coming up to 12 minutes past 7 here in London. That's 12 in Caracas. Now, Venezuela has had 25 years of autocratic rule, which looks set to continue as President Nicolás Maduro's government insists that he won the recent poll, though it hasn't released all the voting machine tallies to prove this. The opposition say they do have the proof, and their supporters have been protesting on the streets since last week's election. Well, I'm joined now by Katie Brown, who's senior lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Exeter and translator of From Savagery by Alejandra Banca about Venezuela's economic crisis and mass displacement of young people. Katie, many thanks for coming on the show. This isn't new. In the recent past, there were post-election protests in 2018 when citizens took to the streets to contest Maduro's re-election. Again in 2019, that was all about Juan Guaido. In this election and the subsequent protests, is this from the same playbook, or is there a different dynamic than previously at play here?
Good morning, Georgina. Thank you for having me to talk about this. Absolutely. I think even protests, you mentioned 2018 onwards, but we've had mass protests since 2014. But this seems like a different election. And I would say the difference really is just how organised the opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, have been. So even though Edmundo González is the presidential candidate, it's really Maria Corina Machado who has been running things behind the scenes. She was originally presidential candidate and then was banned from running by the government-friendly Centro Nacional de Elecciones, so the organisation that runs the elections in the country. But she has spent much of her career working on trying to find ways to ensure that there is democracy in Venezuela. And so what's happened in this election is that they were incredibly organised in getting witnesses in as many of the voting stations as possible and collecting what in Venezuela are called the actas, what you mentioned, the voting tallies. Mm-hmm. So these are proof of the way people voted. In the Venezuelan elections, people vote electronically. The electronic vote is sent directly to the CNE, but it also prints out the acta so that anyone in the room can see that, they have that. And so the opposition have been able to collect about 80% of these actas and have digitized them. They're online for anyone to see. And those show, with 80% of those, Edmundo González having around 67% of the vote, and Maduro having 30% of the vote. So very different to the official tally of 51% for Maduro and 44% for Gonzalez.
Just looking at the demographic of the protesters and comparing it to what's happened before, has the makeup of the crowd changed?
Absolutely. Whether Chavismo, led by Maduro, is actually able to stay in power or not, what we notice is that they have lost the people. This really is the first election where even the former Chavez strongholds have come out against Maduro, against Chavism. It's no longer working for anyone. And we see this in kind of striking visuals across the country of people pulling down statues of Chavez. We're seeing huge amounts of people out in the streets, even from the barrios, which were most supportive of Chavez in previous elections.
Well, and it's not only Venezuelans themselves who are protesting. Many countries in the region, and indeed further afield, have refused to recognise Maduro's win. I wonder if this is in part due to the impact of migration on their countries. I mean, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees says more than 7.7 million people have left the country since 2014. It's the world's largest mass migration of recent time, and that must have had an impact on the region.
Absolutely. And it's worth remembering also that only 70,000 of those people were able to vote. So if their votes were included as well, we could imagine the vote for Gonzalez being even higher. But absolutely. In Colombia, for example, there have been several million Venezuelan arrivals. Also in Chile, in Ecuador, in Brazil. So these are countries who have seen firsthand the experience of Venezuelans. So on the one hand, are maybe more likely to believe what the Venezuelans are saying, but also I assume they don't want more migration to their countries. And around 40% of people in a recent poll just before the election said that if Maduro did win, they would think about leaving. So what we've seen is that Boric in Chile has been quite outspoken. The day after the vote said, this is not believable unless you provide the evidence. And then Brazil, Colombia and Mexico have all called for transparency. They've all said we won't accept the vote until we have evidence. Some of my friends and colleagues in Venezuela, though, are worried about the fact that these countries haven't given any kind of timeline. So they're saying we want transparency, but they're not saying we want transparency within 48 hours or within a week. And so there is the potential that within that time, there could be more fraud. Also, people are worrying now that the longer it goes on, it might lead to calls for another election, potentially with a lot more repression of voters.
And is there any pressure from within Maduro's own government to concede defeat?
So everyone is watching very closely what's happening with the military. It's really the military who have power here. So shortly before the election, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who is a 4-star general and the Minister of Defence, had said that the army and the armed forces would respect the will of the people and that whoever lost would be the loser. And then since the election has changed that statement. Yesterday, he reaffirmed allegiance with Maduro's government. His own cousin has put out a very emotive message on Instagram calling on him to act in a humane way. There's, of course, pressure from other countries on the armed forces as well. What we're seeing at kind of a smaller level is some individual members of the armed forces not being involved in the repression, that it seems to be on the ground that it's more paramilitaries, or what in Venezuela are called colectivos, who are more active in the repression of those protests.
And Katie, if you had to give it your best guess, what happens next?
I feel like Maduro is going to cling on as long as possible. Partly because he fears what will happen to him when he's no longer in power. But I question kind of how long can you run a country that is potentially empty. How long can you run a country where you really don't have the people behind you? And so I don't think this is going to be resolved anytime soon. But I also feel that in the long run, this regime can't continue without any popular support.
Katie, thank you very much indeed. That's Katie Brown there. Now, still to come on the programme.
The Google app. Now with more ways to search. Tap the camera icon to find these roller skates. Magic. Search what you see. Now in the Google app.
Hugh Langley joins us to discuss a landmark US ruling against Google's effective monopoly in online search and advertising and the wider impact of big tech on politics. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Ben Kelly, Senior Audience Editor of Newsweek. Good morning to you, Ben.
Good morning.
Now, we're talking a lot about tech companies in the programme today. And there's a big piece in The Guardian about far-right forums being used to plan UK riots and also encouraging anti-Semitic attacks. Tell us more.
Yeah, these are two stories The Guardian are leading with this morning, which feed into the wider story about the riots in the UK. And obviously we know Sir Keir Starmer held a Cobra meeting last night and they're expecting some unrest this evening potentially. And the warning in particular is around immigration lawyers who are being told that they must take extra security measures or even stay away from work altogether because of, the sort of far-right activists online releasing lists of immigration advice centres where they may obviously work and help people. And we've obviously seen places like this being targeted already, asylum hotels and so forth. But this is something they fear for this evening and potentially going forward. The Law Society and Immigration Law Practitioners Association said their members were at risk and they've been quite angry in their statements. There's also been some comments from leading lawyers, including Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General, who interestingly is pointing the finger at some of his former colleagues in the Conservative Party, saying that they demonise sort of lefty lawyers. A lot of people are drawing that link between, pointing out that these are the people who are carrying out these actions that you don't like, quote unquote, and therefore they're the targets.
Now, they're also talking about the fact that there is a focus on Jews, on what they're calling gypsies, all of these ancient hate tropes just coming back.
Yeah, this is really bizarre, and also it kind of shows you where this is going, this group, and who's part of it and where it extends to. A sort of odd, broad church that brings in, once you start dipping into the far right, these things do come back bizarrely. And so, there are online spaces that are being used to encourage these riots, which are also housing anti-Jewish messages and saying that Jews should also be targets. I was interested to read here that one forum, The Guardian says, is allegedly run by a suspected neo-Nazi, and he's believed to be based overseas. And this is really interesting because there's so many people who are instigating or provoking what's going on at the moment in the UK who are overseas. Not least someone we've Tommy Robinson, who's in Southern Europe on his
Elon Musk
as well, right up to the top. Yeah.
And what the CST, that's the Community Security Trust, is saying that there's high security now for synagogues, for Jewish schools, for community halls. But of course, we're also seeing that around mosques and community centres, particularly in the north of England.
Yeah, and that's what sort of, it's almost a sort of it's a bit of the horseshoe effect, isn't it? Where once you start to sort of getting into any minorities that you kind of want to point the finger at, it does sort of show up and spotlight what some of these people who are provoking this really believe. And it's maybe not as specific as it began, this is all supposed to be in response to the terrible murder of 3 young girls. And now it looks like it's just a bit of an open season on anyone who is other.
Yeah. Now, talking about schools and community centres, a story coming out of the US talking about how Arizona's schools don't want to be polling locations. Why is that?
I found this very interesting. Arizona's largest public school board don't want their schools being used as election centres this year coming up. In particular, we're looking at this place called Maricopa County. It's home to Phoenix and more than half of the swing state's registered voters, so it's quite huge. They're citing difficult elections that they had, sort of local ones last November, and then the midterms the previous year, where there were issues with people claiming that their ballots weren't being counted properly, the machines had issues. Some things were problematic, but other things were sort of inflated by conspiracists and so on. You may know of the US politician Carrie Lake, who was running there in that seat to be governor in 2022. She's running again in the Senate this year. A big Trump fan. She's got a lot of Trump supporters behind her, and they're very angry people. And this school board is saying, this time last year, a lot of their workers there, and even people just work at the schools, were getting targeted by people who are, let's face it, very angry, often armed. It's not really something you want to be doing when you're going to cast your ballot. And it was interesting to read here that 37% of polling stations were schools in 2016, and now it's down to 14%.
Very, very interesting. Now, how far is konnichiwa going to get you in Japan? This is a great story in the New York Times. It says Japan needs foreign workers. It's just not sure it wants them to stay. This is all about learning languages.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the broad story, which I find fascinating. I know a lot of people do, about Japan's declining birth rate, and in tandem, its complete, fear of allowing foreign workers and allowing immigration to become an issue in their country. And this piece in the New York Times in particular spotlights some foreign-born workers there from places like Nepal and Myanmar, people fleeing violence who say they want to work in Japan because it's safe. And Japan is letting in some more immigrants, but it's really not that many at all. I think it's saying here up to 2 million in a country of 125 million. And yes, it spotlights on language, and it says that unlike somewhere like Germany, for example, where new foreign residents are given up to 400 hours, subsidised language learning, the government gives nothing in Japan, and therefore it's up to private companies who are going to hire these people to give them any help. And they spotlight on this one nursing home operator in the town that they've spotlighted, which gives caregivers 1 day of Japanese lessons before they get to work. I'm not sure how far I'd get with 1 day of Japanese lessons.
Extraordinary. Finally, let's look at mental health. We know that we're in the middle of a mental health crisis pretty much globally, and part of that also is that there just aren't enough mental health practitioners to speak to people to help them through difficult times. But Le Monde says that perhaps AI could step in.
Yeah, again, I find this fascinating. This is probably maybe one of the positive things that's going to come from AI that we've been hearing about. According to OpenAI, its chatbot can now hold fluid oral discussions and read the emotions of its users. People are using it to give it therapy. There's a quote here from someone who says, "The best experience I've ever had with therapy. I cried several times and told things I'd never told anyone before." So you're sort of typing into a chatbot and it's giving you your solutions to your problems back.
But that's quite extraordinary that they can actually decode our emotions.
It is. It's slightly frightening. I mean, we know it as being something that gives you facts and gives you solutions and so forth. I suppose this is the next logical step. And the more that you feed into it, of course, the more it learns.
Ben Kelly, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The leader of Hezbollah has pledged a strong and effective response to the killing of its military commander by Israel last week, no matter the consequences, and said Hezbollah would act either alone or with its regional allies. He said the response to the twin killing of top Hezbollah and Hamas figures would be more powerful, but that delaying it was part of a strategy to exert psychological pressure on Israel. Kyiv kept up air attacks on Russia's Kursk border region today, with defence systems destroying at least 5 drones overnight, its acting governor said, after Moscow accused Ukraine of targeting the area with an armoured assault. The Russian Defence Ministry said it had sent reserves to help repel hundreds of Ukrainian fighters backed by tanks in a ground incursion shaping as one of the largest into Russian territory during the war, now more than 2 years old. And the Philippines, Canada, United States and Australia kicked off their first joint military exercise today in the South China Sea to enhance interoperability amongst their forces, the 4 countries' military said. The 2-day exercise, which will involve naval and air force units, is the first amongst the 4 countries and follows the first Philippines-Japan joint exercise in the disputed South China Sea last week. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. In May last year, Peter Limjaroenrat and his Progressive Move Forward party, the MFP, won first place in the Thai general election. But despite getting more than 30% of the vote, that's 148 seats in Thailand's 500-seat parliament, and convincing partners to join him in a coalition, the old guard rallied to keep him from becoming prime minister. And now they want to ban his party altogether. Well, James Chambers is Monocle's Asia editor. He's based in Bangkok and he joins me now. James, Thailand has a history of banning political parties. How and why has it happened before?
Yes, I think if the Move Forward party does get dissolved in a few hours from now, it would be the 9th party since 2007. So the act of banning a political party is certainly not new in this country. But I think what is interesting about this case and what is important is just as you said, they did win the most seats in the election last year. They are extremely popular, and their de facto leader, Peter Limjaroenrat, is a global figure now, and he has been whipping up international interest in this story. So the eyes of the world are on this particular case.
Who wants to ban the MFP and why?
Well, it's the age-old tool of clamping down on any kind of opposition, the lèse-majesté laws here in Thailand, Section 112. The Move Forward party, as part of their campaign, wanted to reform this law because it has been used by the kind of conservative elites to keep their stranglehold on power and to keep out, parties like Move Forward. So it's slightly ironic now that it's going to be potentially lead to their downfall. So the Election Commission petitioned the Constitutional Court, basically alleging that the Move Forward party were trying to overthrow the monarchy by wanting to reform this provision in the criminal code. And so in about an hour and a half, we'll find out from the Constitutional Court what they make of it. And I guess the conventional wisdom suggests that the party will be dissolved, although Peter is confident as ever, and he's declared today that history will not repeat itself because, of course, the Move Forward's predecessor, the Future Forward Party, they were banned in 2020. So he still remained confident. And there is a school of thought to suggest that they may actually have a chance.
I mean, if they are dissolved, I wonder what that means for the government and what happens to all the lawmakers from the party who have been democratically elected.
So in terms of the government, that's led by Thai, who were one of the parties that were going to join Move Forward in the coalition, but then kind of turned against them at the last minute and sided with the old guard. Now, they're not directly involved in this. This is a judicial process. This is the Constitutional Court. So they're basically standing aside and saying, well, it's got nothing to do with us. But for Move Forward, if they do get dissolved, then they're 151 odd MPs will have to find a new home. And there's already suggestions that they've lined up a small party to jump ship. And no doubt in due course, that party will be renamed. It'll be, Future Forward, Move Forward, something forward. And they've got a new leader lined up as well, a lady who's waiting to take over from Peter if he does get banned, because not just the party being dissolved, the leadership could get a 10-year ban from politics. So I guess it'd be a clean solution, a clean end for Move Forward, actually, if they do get dissolved, because the MPs will all just move to a new party, which will be renamed, and they'll just continue with a clean slate. It might get a bit complicated, actually, if the Constitutional Court decide for whatever reason not to ban them, because there is a tradition of kind of using these charges and kind of keeping them hanging over parties like a sword of Damocles to kind of keep them in line. And so if Move Forward were to survive today, no doubt there would be another probably allegation or legal case brought up in the future to try and kind of keep them in check, because that was what happened to their predecessor, the Future Forward. They survived their case in the Constitutional Court in 2020, which was a lèse majesté case, but then soon afterwards they were dissolved for a case involving political funding. So even if Move Forward survived today, I imagine they'd find themselves in legal difficulties in the future.
James, thank you very much indeed. We'll check in back with you for the results of that decision, as you say, happening in about an hour and a half there in Bangkok. This is Monocle Radio. It is 8:35 in Zurich. That's 2:35 in Washington, D.C. Well, we turn our attention to big tech and social media now. Hugh Langley is a senior correspondent for Business Insider, covering Google and the technology sector. And he joins me now in the studio. Many thanks for coming in. So much to talk about. Let's start with this ruling by a US judge who says that Google acted illegally to crush its competition and maintain a monopoly on online search and related advertising. Can you unpick that for us?
Yeah, so this case was filed against Google in 2020 by the US Department of Justice, and it centers around accusations that Google was a monopoly and breaking antitrust laws by the way it behaved when it comes to online search. So we all know Google obviously is the biggest search engine in the world. We all use it. And the accusations were that Google had basically kept rivals out by doing certain deals, behaving in certain ways, that basically kept it as top dog in the market. So a lot of the focus was on these things called default distribution, which was how Google pays companies to be the default search engine. So when you open up your iPhone and you go to Safari browser and start browsing, the default engine you get is Google in that case. And Google pays partners, including Apple, Android partners, all these others, to basically be in that position. So much of the case focused on that. And yesterday, the judge in the case ruled that Google had, in fact, violated antitrust law and, to use his word, was considered a monopolist. And that's where we kind of stand right now.
Why are there so many monopolies in big tech?
There was just a period of time where these companies just kept growing and growing. There wasn't much regulation. What's interesting about this case is there's a thing called the Sherman Act, it's a 19th century law that was introduced to, stop monopolies from happening. But it was really focused on sort of like big oil, these older kind of ideas, and it wasn't really built for tech. So what's been an issue has been trying to enforce antitrust law against these companies as they've gotten bigger and bigger. And that's quite difficult. So what's so significant about this case is that it effectively sort of interprets that law for a type of company doing things like I mentioned with like paying these phone companies and things like that to be the default search engine, which wasn't really in mind when the act was created.
I want to talk about Elon Musk now and his social media site X, formerly Twitter. There's a lot of headlines coming out about him this week. He's suing a group of major companies alleging that they unlawfully conspired to boycott his site. That's one part of the story. Another headline is that he's going to move the headquarters of his companies to Texas, and that's all to do with him disagreeing with laws on gender. His child is transgender. He thinks California encouraged that. He's very much on an ideological level opposed from that. He's also come under fire for the race riots we're seeing here in Britain. So let's look at his involvement and how someone like him could influence our politics. For instance, Tommy Robinson, just one of a number of people who uses X to promote disorder. He was banned by Twitter. Musk takes over. Suddenly he's back. We know that his posts, he says, have been viewed 1.2 billion times in the 3 months to August. So this is all enabled by Musk. How he decides to use his platform directly influences our lives. We see him now turning right. He's supporting Trump. He's giving him money. Trump says he's going to debate him next week. Yeah. What does this mean for democracy?
Well, when Elon bought then called Twitter, now called X, he wanted to really turn. He was really sort of grinding his gears over this idea of free speech, and what we're seeing now is that play out, which is that effectively he's basically made the platform a free-for-all, right? So we've seen that, like you said, bringing Tommy Robinson back on, bringing these controversial characters. I think Alex Jones was also banned. I think he brought him back as well. And then it's basically just said, have at it. And now what's happening, I think, is we're seeing the consequences of that. And I think it's taken an incident like these riots to really lay that out. Elon's position on this is obviously, we have community notes features. If there's misinformation, the people will sort it out themselves. Elon believes this idea that sort of free speech sorts itself out. But a lot of people obviously don't believe that's the case. So, yes, I mean, obviously X still has, despite people saying they were going to leave it when he bought it still has a lot of people on the platform. A lot of people are seeing misinformation. A lot of these accounts that Elon is engaging with, particularly, I think, which is what's most concerning, are these accounts that are really sort of out there just trying to we call it like rage baiting, trying to get people to engage, often with misinformation, spreading lies about, various aspects of these riots. And that's obviously had an effect. And Elon just doesn't really seem to care that much.
I mean, he's obviously the most visible and the richest of these people, but is he taking the rest of Silicon Valley with him? Are these people more inclined to vote for the Republicans, possibly because of what you were talking about, re-monopolies?
There's an element of that. I think what's been really interesting to see in Silicon Valley lately is there's been a bit of a split on a very public level that we haven't really seen before. A lot of this was exacerbated the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. After that, we saw Elon Musk. We saw some very heavyweight venture capitalists, Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz, David Sachs, these people who either investors or big venture capitalists that had these debates under the surface before. It wasn't as public, and now they were all sort of coming out saying, I fully endorse Donald Trump. I fully endorse Donald Trump. At the same time, Kamala stepping in has created an interesting counterbalance to that, because we've seen a lot of tech and VC folks rallying behind her. So I wouldn't say everyone has jumped on the Elon bandwagon, and I think it kind of remains to be seen how this is going to play out. But I think Elon has helped. How do I put this? Kind of rile up a bit of a base and a bit of support around Donald Trump, for sure.
So, I mean, if the tech companies decide that they want to see Trump in charge and they welcome the inevitable ensuing chaos, is there anything we can do? They control our data. They tell us what to look at in terms of the algorithms and so on. How safe is democracy if Silicon Valley decides it wants a particular result?
Well, that's the interesting question. I think it's less likely we're going to see the leaders of the big tech companies like we've talked about, Google, Amazon, and I think Mark Zuckerberg has said he's not outright endorsing anyone. Their companies are very, like we've seen with this Google lawsuit, for example, the level of regulation really changes between administrations. They don't want to be regulated, ultimately. So, they're watching closely. The Google lawsuit came under the Trump administration. At the same time, Trump has said, he wants to kind of enable more innovation in some ways. And some people in Silicon Valley see that as, oh, great, if we bring Trump in, there may be a little less regulation on certain aspects. AI, for example, he said he wants to repeal a executive order Biden put in to basically regulate AI a bit more. And some people were like, well, hey, that looks like a good thing. So the whims of Silicon Valley, to your point, are really about what's going to be good for them. And that's honestly kind of what it comes down to. What's good for business, not necessarily what's good for the users.
No, absolutely. And AI is a particular point because, of course, that, as we have already seen, could be used to subvert the truth.
Yeah, and that's, obviously that is a little terrifying with the election cycle. We're seeing a lot of, AI use for deepfakes. Not that this is new. We've seen it in past election cycles too. But it's only going to get worse. And there certainly needs to be a real level of consciousness of that, not just at the tech company level, but at, the government level as well. We're seeing a bit of that come in. But yeah, for sure, there's going to be a level of regulation. The question is just how much at the moment.
So, I mean, finally, how can we, just as ordinary people who use tech, how can we guard against being unduly influenced and make sure that we're not being made to vote for something we don't, in our hearts, really want?
I just think now more than ever, a hyper awareness of what you're looking at and questioning where it's come from and whether it's even true or not. I mean, like we've, to the point about the riots recently, a lot of what has been spread around X and other social platforms as well, it's just outright false. And unfortunately, people get caught off guard by that. And it's become worse as for example, with X, as Elon has sort of said, have at it, and everyone can just say what they want. That problem's been exacerbated. I mean, people maybe forget, but Twitter used to do not a great, maybe, but fairly decent job at somewhat regulating some of this stuff, moderating some of this stuff. And that's kind of gone away under Elon. So, with these platforms, I think people just need to be extra aware that, there are also, reasons people might be spreading this stuff. Maybe they're making money. There are incentives for certain people on Twitter, for example, on X, to make money from getting engagement. And sometimes that's through lying. So I would say just like a hyper awareness of what you're looking at and knowing that, not a lot of these things are actually true.
Hugh, thank you very much indeed. That was Hugh Langley, senior correspondent for Business Insider. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Well, it's time to talk urbanism now with Jessica Bridger, who's Monocle's contributing editor, and she has a new job. She's Senior Visiting Fellow in the Architecture Department of Singapore National University. Jessica, congratulations. Big change for you. You've moved to Singapore.
Thanks, Georgina. It is a big change, but it is only temporary. I'm here until the end of November, and then I return to home in Switzerland.
Okay, well, because I don't guess there's not a lot of skiing in Singapore. I know that's one of your passions.
No, sadly, there is no skiing in Singapore, but it is a beautiful place to live, even though it lacks that one recreational option.
Now, of course, they're celebrating their National Day on Friday, and tell us what that feels like. Is there lots of preparation, lots of pomp and ceremony coming up?
So there is a lot of pomp and ceremony. There are flags up everywhere. They've been doing practice runs of fireworks and some exercises with military aircraft, and everyone is turning out. There's even a catchy national song. And Singapore, I think we all know and love Singapore at Monocle, and the rest of the world knows and loves Singapore. But it's more than just hawker stalls, good food, organized everything, really good transport. It's really a city that I think has a lot going for it in a fundamental way. And that's why it always is in the Monocle Quality of Life survey. It was number 18 this year.
So why is it interesting in an urban way?
So Singapore has, over the last 59 years since its independence and founding, undertaken such a range of urbanistic projects and invested in the urban realm, bringing experts, trying ideas from all over the world to try to build housing, mass transport, public areas in a way that really works. In a city, it's a nation state, which is about 700 hectare, and even though it's expanding with land reclamation, and they have to build really dense, and they're asking questions about how to do that well.
And they even have a global centre for livable cities.
Yes. So the Center for Livable Cities is a national agency, and basically they're saying that urban quality of life relies on overall livability, looking at a lot of indicators. And one of the ways that they guide development is the Singapore Livability Framework. And in June, they just announced updates to it. And it's composed of 3 poles: a competitive economy, a sustainable environment, and a high quality of life. And most interestingly, the framework acknowledges urban competition and conflict. Things aren't always going to go well. It's not always going to be harmonious, but how we find the balance, how Singapore in its development can find a balance between conflicting and competing interests and propose synergies and collaboration is something that they see as key to move forward to build the city better.
Let's go to Taipei. Now, this is a really odd story because it's not how these things normally work. Some super tall towers are going to get a bit shorter.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a funny one. A Taiwanese-Austrian colleague here at the university flagged this story, which ran in Taiwan's United Daily News. And it's about the Taipei Twin Towers, which are super tall buildings slated to open in 2027 and well underway. And they are reducing in size. They're going about 9 meters lower each, one from 289 meters to 280, and one from a whopping 369 meters to 360. And now that's an interesting thing because it doesn't happen that often. But the kind of payoff to that is the developers are significantly increasing the commercial space by almost 3 times and the public functionality of the podium that the towers are on top of. Now, interestingly, the towers themselves were originally designed by the Dutch office MVRDV, which was pretty wild. And the design itself actually was changed in 2019 to something by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, which is much more solid and measured and reasonable, which fits its position in the middle of Taipei.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. I would really like to hear more about that, and I'm quite sure that you will be doing a little feature for us on that at some point. Let's look now at Pier 42 in New York City. Now, parks. Parks is something New York does well.
Yeah, New York really gets it right when it comes to parks. And that goes back to Central Park, which is one of the precedents for the invention of the urban recreational park that was designed to counteract what at the time was seen as the ills of the city. And New York has kept up that tradition. You know, we all know the High Line or the massive Brooklyn Bridge Park, or the absolutely enormous 30-year long-range plan to transform the former landfill at Fresh Kills into a huge urban island park. These are spectacular things. But at the same time, New York has just built a new part of its idea to surround all of Manhattan with green space, and that's at Pier 42.
So how will that work?
So it's an 8-acre link in this round Manhattan green space, and it is providing really very much needed urban open space and recreational facilities to a part of New York that has a lot of public housing and not a lot of green space on the Lower East Side. And that is kind of a valuable link, not only for the local community, but because it plays into the larger park systems in New York, the overall spread of green open space, an embrace of that in a city which is often seen as extremely dense and very unfriendly, even though it has really exemplary public urban parks.
Jessica, before we go, just talking a little bit about your new position, part of what you're teaching is all about learning from global examples.
Yes, I think the value of a design education is in how to see the world. And I think we learn how to see the world not only from local examples or examples that maybe we're familiar with from home for students that come from abroad, but from learning from what is done the best. And most importantly, how can that be translated back to the local context where students end up working? And I think that's important for all of us as journalists, as urban practitioners of any sort, whether we're urban mayors, you know, rural council people, or architects, urban designers, to see what is happening in the world, what are the good points that it accomplishes, and how can we learn from it?
Absolutely. Jessica, many thanks for joining us. That's Jessica Bridger there, and you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, let's head to Paris to join the Monocle team there. They're in place to bring you live radio from the heart of the Olympic city. Emma Nelson joins me now from Maison Alliance to tell us what will be on the show at the top of the hour. Good morning. Bonjour.
Good morning. Bonjour a little bit, but very good morning this morning, Georgina, because Tom Webb, our deputy head of radio, and I went back to the United Kingdom last night.
Oh, yes.
In France. We went back. We went to GB House for an event, and it was a very lovely dinner. But Tom Webb, just step up to the microphone. It was the most astonishing culture shock I think we've ever experienced, haven't we? Because we've got quite used, Georgina, to the refined, discreet, elegant way that Paris comports itself. GB obviously getting really, really tons and tons and tons of medals, doing really well, Tom, and they were enjoying themselves.
Well, they were with their mums from Norfolk and Nottingham. We'd gone from 5-star Parisian hotel to the QE2 on its way to Harwich after a very boozy overnight with lorry drivers.
It was like going to a wedding, Georgina, and you had these people nursing their pints, sitting around and it was just like being transported back to a Wetherspoons. And then there was the dance floor, which was absolutely phenomenal. And especially one lady who literally screamed across the entrance hall of this very elegant pavilion in the Bois de Boulogne, has a reputation for being one of the most beautiful locations in Paris to hold events. And she screamed across the front desk where all these Olympians and their parents were standing. What was she saying, Tom?
She was announcing that the dance floor is open. They're playing Ed Sheeran.
It was absolutely amazing. So,
did you vogue at it, Emma?
Did I vogue?
Yeah.
No, but we are going to the Vogue thing on Thursday. Anybody who missed Monocle in Paris yesterday, you missed a treat, because we had this wonderful man called Vinny Revlon who taught us how to vogue without actually telling us how to vogue. And I can't remember, Tom, what was the instructions? So every 4 beats you have, and I'm going to swear, you have to show your most badass bitch pose, and that's how you vogue. So anybody who's listening and who doesn't know how to vogue, simple, every 4 beats, your most badass bitch pose.
But what is your most badass bitch pose, Emma? I'm not sure I'd ever thought I'd ask anybody that question.
Well, the wheels have come off here in Paris, Georgina.
Go on.
There was quite a few badass bitch poses yesterday on the dance floor at the GB House. The thing about voguing is that you have to change your pose every 4 beats, which actually I would imagine would be quite exhausting if you've got a 4-minute track. I'd run out of ideas after the first 30 seconds.
Absolutely. Tom Webb, are you still there?
I am. No, there's a bit of detail that Emma's not mentioning.
I thought
you
so.
have to imagine that you are flicking through Vogue magazine itself and imagining those models on each of the glorious pages.
I promise you that was not the case at the GB House last night, was it?
No, so it wasn't as refined as the rest of Paris. So if it was the kind of venue where this did actually happen, that a waiter dropped a silver tray and it clanged on the floor, to which everyone went, "Way!"
Of course they did. All right. I mean, you just had it for one evening. Some of us have to live it. It's our day to day. Tell us about the big name on today's programme.
Oh, we have got a very, very big name on today. We'd actually better stop giggling because we have the Olympic Games Executive Director for the International Olympic Committee. Basically, he runs the show, Christophe Duby. He joined as a trainee at the IOC 3 decades ago, and he now manages absolutely everything. And he has literally just walked in. A very good morning to you, Christophe.
He's voguing as well.
He's voguing. He's coming in. This poor man's just walked into chaos. But if he can run an Olympics, I'm sure he can handle the next 15 to 20 minutes when we're going to be talking to him about how you prepare for not just an immediate games, but how you structure a legacy, how you choose your cities, how you make sure that the strategy that you put in place serves the city rather than the city serving the games. So, and we'll ask him. He went into the games pretty confident. There were a few interviews when he said, "Yep."
Oh, I think we've lost you. Emma, are you still there?
I am still there. Yes,
you dropped out for a minute.
I think Monsieur Duby's doing a better job of running the games and the connection back to London. I think it decided to let us down momentarily, but it's good. We're back. We've recovered.
Excellent. Well, we're going to hear much, much more from your guest and indeed from you and possibly Tom. That's in just a couple of minutes' time. We'll also hear about furniture, I believe.
Yes, we will. We will be talking to a young furniture designer who is using old techniques of leatherwork to actually create some of the most beautiful bespoke furniture that you could ever imagine. And it's what's quite nice is it uses old techniques, but it's so cutting edge and just so luxurious. It's a pleasure.
Emma, thank you so much. We'll speak to you soon. That's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Chris Chomak and Monica Lillis, our researcher, Sana Jumani, and our studio manager, Flynn Simons. And at the top of the hour, as you know, we're going to cross to Monocle in Paris. The briefing is live at midday in London, and the Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.